There are a few true giants within the world of classical music, and the fact of the matter is, due to the lore behind them, and in many cases, the sheer size of their catalog, it can often be very difficult to figure out where to start. So for this month's classical sauce, I'm just going to concentrate on one composer, one of the big ones, Mozart. We're going to look at three of the best known works from all across his life and his massive number of compositions. And combined, you'll have a somewhat decent introduction to one of the greatest composers of all time. The first piece we're going to talk about is Serenade number 13, which is sometimes referred to as Eine, Kleine, Nachtmusik. Pardon my German. This is one of, if not Mozart's most famous piece for chamber ensemble, and he finished it in 1787. The alternate title to it pretty much means a little serenade, and it was taken from a note that Mozart left in his own records. Chances are this was actually not supposed to be the name of the piece, but more of a personal note to himself that it was done. Though most people are unaware, Mozart actually wrote this work while he was finishing up Don Giovanni, and most historians are a bit confused as to why he seemed to take a break from that to do this. Also adding to the odd nature of this is the fact that almost all of Mozart's serenades were written by commission, and yet there's no record of a commission for this piece. And on top of that, there's actually no record of the first performance of this piece. Furthermore, the piece actually wasn't formally published until 1827, which is more than 30 years after his death. But this is largely attributed to the fact that his widow sold a large stack of his works to somebody, and they probably had to take some time to go through them. The work itself is easily one of the most instantly recognizable pieces in the entire Mozart canon, and it quickly slides into this wonderfully graceful and wistful movement. This piece really represents everything people tend to love about classical music, as it has these fantastic swells and sways all across the piece, along with more upbeat, energizing paths and themes. To this day, it remains one of the most heavily performed pieces by Mozart, and it's been transcribed over the years to fit almost every instrument thinkable. And while you may not be aware of it, chances are you've heard this piece performed tons of times in your life. The next work of Mozart that I want to talk about is Symphony number 40, better known as the Great G Minor Symphony. This stands as one of only two symphonies that Mozart wrote in a minor key, and many people will argue that this is his greatest piece of all time. Completed in 1788, this is one of three pieces that he completed in an astonishing 8-week period that year. And oddly enough, a lot of early scholars said that this piece was never meant for performance and more for study purposes. And they go on to say that Mozart himself never saw this piece performed on his own. However, this has been largely debunked in recent years, as there's a very infamous performance when Mozart himself was absolutely present. But the performance in question was apparently so poorly done that the composer got up and left very quickly. So maybe the scholars of the time felt that they really didn't want to rehash this embarrassing moment and pretended that he never saw it. But further debunking these myths is the fact that Mozart actually revised the piece, and you can basically assume that he probably saw it performed live, saw some changes he wanted to make, and redid it. Regardless of the historical arguments, this is one of those pieces that everybody should or most likely already does know very well, and from the moment it begins, it is easily one of the finest classically styled symphonies ever. There's this slightly nervous feeling that runs throughout a majority of the first movement, and the way that the main theme eventually juxtaposes the rest of the instrumentation is, for lack of a better word, genius. This work also has a much darker feel than a majority of Mozart's work, and some may recognize one of the themes here because it was taken from his 21st Piano Concerto, which he completed a few years earlier. It's that darkness and tension that run through the entire piece that continue to make this a huge hit with live audiences to this day. This is really one of those amazing classical works that even people who try and shun the genre will no doubt be drawn in by. And from a compositional point of view, this is without question one of Mozart's most complex and complete works of his entire career. The final work from Mozart that I want to talk about today is the Magic Flute. This is actually one of Mozart's operas, and he completed it in 1791, only 3 months before his death. Mozart wrote this after getting the libretto, which definitely gave the idea of a fairy tale, and even without the words and the actors, you can definitely hear that tone within the music. Also, with the way that he's constructed the music and the way that it moves, you can definitely tell that Mozart was specifically writing with the actors and singers in mind, as most of the singing parts have a lead-in from the strings so that the singer in question can find the proper key. And also, there's a bit of doubling during the vocal parts, so Mozart was basically helping to lead the vocalist through the part. This really isn't that surprising because at the time, Mozart had a very good working relationship with the theater and had done work for them before. And he'd also collaborated before on a number of pieces with the libretto's writer. After its premiere, this opera was unquestionably a hit, and it was performed more than 100 times within the first year alone, and it remains one of the 5 most performed operas to this day. Turning specifically to the music, it clearly follows the storyline set forth. And yet it's the way that Mozart's really able to make this music move with a smaller group of musicians that really sets this aside from his other work. Throughout this piece, you'll find a number of themes and passages that other composers have adapted over the years, and you can even find references to it all throughout popular culture, though much like the first piece I mentioned, this one has an odd note to it. In the original manuscript, one of the instruments Mozart called for basically translates into an instrument of steel. And while most historians try and write this off as a keyed glockenspiel, the actual instrument that Mozart was calling for remains unknown to this day. This work really shows off the various styles and classical perfection that Mozart had achieved in his career, and as it remains one of his very last works, it is certainly certainly a great summary of one of the greatest composers ever. The reality is there's just so much going on within the catalog of Mozart that it's very difficult to figure out where to start. And he worked across so many different styles and disciplines that he has greatness in every area possible. And these three works I've mentioned are nowhere near comprehensive, you must know that. But they're rather a few starting points or inroads into one of the most accomplished musicians in all of music history. You just can't deny the massive importance that classical music has had on every single genre of music. So take some time this week and get your classical on.